Hi, it's Sunday, December 13th, I believe, here in Nevada, Iowa. It's a cool, rainy day, overcast. Actually, it's kind of an unusual weather. The rain has lasted all night, and the small lake right next here is out of its banks. So that's very unusual for this time of year. Normally, the lake would be completely frozen. We'd have like a foot of snow. There'd be 500 or 600 Canadian geese out here who normally take off to go south about this time of the month. I don't see any of them out there today. It looks like they're in some place staying warm, I hope. Actually, it's one of those days where you'd like to just crawl into a warm bed and sleep all afternoon, which sounds inviting, but I would like to share another session here with you. This one deals with how the New Independent Party looks at chaos, crisis, balance, balloons, and moving equilibrium. So it's a kind of a complicated area to get into, but again, it's one of those foundations that I think is important to understand what's actually going on here in the United States. Yesterday, the big conference in Paris, now 200 countries have signed on to a global warming mandate to keep the rise in global temperatures under 2 Celsius degrees, which most scientists are saying is impossible. I, on the other hand, think they might all be very surprised to have it happen next year. It's getting to the point where we could see those kind of increases in a year, certainly in a decade. I don't think anything came out of that conference that's going to change anything. It looks to me like a very large dog and pony show, so they can try and make the world aware of these concerns, but nothing that they came up with is going to change anything. So I'm disappointed in that, but I'm glad that they made the effort. What it's going to lead to is basically a crisis. We're going to see parts of the world get very warm and very arid, and people are going to have to move, and other parts of the world are going to get very, very wet, just like we are here in Nevada. Excuse me, and I think that's kind of what they're planning on, maybe even expecting. So, where I'd like to take this today is, I mentioned last time that some people think Americans are dumb cows, that they believe anything that is told to them by the government, and I don't see it that way. I've been teaching for 40 years, and to be honest, I don't think I've had a student in 40 years who believes that Lee Harvey Oswald was alone and involved in the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Not one. So what does that tell you? It would seem that our young people either are highly opinionated or they're not afraid of conspiracy, but I don't think you have to be a conspiracy nut to see that not everybody's believing everything that the government's saying about some of these controversies. However, I've run into several faculty members who were just aghast that anybody wouldn't believe the Warren report. So maybe it's a generational thing, I'm not sure. But I think young people and millions of people who've looked at YouTube kind of videos are very skeptical about a lot of the information that's coming to us from the government and from the mass media and mainstream media. But I'm trying to say today that a lot of this is very deliberate. There are people who want to see chaos. They want to see nations going through economic problems. They want to see nations having social unrest. They want to see nations having conflict, and the reason is that it's profitable for them. I know your first thought is going to be, how is that possible? But it's not. When you get into it and you look at what really is going on behind the scenes, you'll find that people benefit from the chaos. They like to see destruction so somebody else has to build it. Look at what happened in Libya. There was no reason to destroy that whole country. Almost every bridge, every highway, every infrastructure was totally destroyed. That means somebody else has to rebuild it. And because they have the oil, there's going to be, money there available for somebody to make a lot of money. And I think the same thing has happened in Iraq and in Syria and Afghanistan. So we've deliberately gone in there under one level and said, we're protecting freedom or building democracy and all of that kind of song and dance. But really, our agenda has been to create chaos. And when you consider that hundreds of thousands of innocent people have died and millions of people have had to move or are in some kind of refugee situation now, I think it's about time that Americans, if they're aware of all of this, that they express some feelings about this, that we basically are willing to stand up and say, this has got to end. This is not rational, it's not reasonable, and it's certainly not morally ethical in any way. So, who are the people that are creating havoc and chaos? Well, again, what we're seeing are those very large corporate interests, special interests, whether they're the military-industrial complex, we can obviously see how they benefit from it. I've seen some studies that basically conclude that every war we've been in since World War II has been a war of profit for the military-industrial complex. They got into Korea, they got into Vietnam, they've gotten into Iraq and Afghanistan to make money. And they've made hundreds of billions of dollars in these kinds of enterprising, profit-making kind of activities. And it would appear that they're behind some of the chaos that was created to get us into these kinds of situations. I don't really want to get into the details of that. You can do that on your own. But they're often called false flags, situations that are created so that emotional response is such that it gets us involved. We certainly can see how Pearl Harbor was one of those situations. The news wanted you to believe that it was a complete surprise, but many reports are coming out now that the people in the White House, the OSI, intelligence group, they knew it was coming, and they could have warned the ships to leave Pearl Harbor, and they did not. So you have to wonder about a government that would allow 3,000 people to die just to have a symbolic response to get into the Second World War. But we did it again in Vietnam. It's called the Tonga Bay Incident. I actually met the captain of that ship that was supposedly targeted by North Vietnamese. It never happened. It was a false situation that was created to get Congress, emotionally involved, and they passed almost unanimously to get involved in Vietnam. And then we see, this event of 9/11, and again, you have to wonder if somebody hasn't orchestrated that. It's awful hard for me to believe that some, people in caves in Afghanistan can orchestrate this kind of coordinated attack using 5 different airplanes on different sites and different buildings and have it be completely successful. It just doesn't make any sense to me. I would have to believe that it was a contracted job of some sort, and I'm sure millions of people agree with it. So, those are examples of false flags that have been basically put on Americans so that we react in a certain way. And I fear that we're going to see more of these. I would be willing to guess that we're going to see some kind of attack, a cyber attack, or a direct attack on our electric grid. You know, if all of a sudden everybody in America was without electricity, I think we would see a huge emotional response to that, particularly if it was directed towards one nation or one group or ISIS or somebody. And I think what I'm trying to suggest is that Americans need to be very careful about these kinds of false events, because they could get us into Third World War or a regional war very quickly that's going to benefit, again, the military-industrial complex, but large banks are involved in those kind of false flags as well. So I think it's time, I know it's time, that Americans need to move in new directions. And, there's a saying in government that never let a good crisis go to waste. You figure out some way to benefit your party or your budget or your special interest groups. That's crazy stuff. We have to figure out ways to balance things out so that we don't continually go on to this roller coaster ride of false events and scares and creating a symbolic fear just so somebody can make money. But it's not just those large things. We see it in the financial sector as well. The people that make the most money in the stock markets and bonds, they like the fact that the stock market goes up and it comes down, because they make money both ways. They make money, by having the stock market goes up, their stock prices go up, but then because they can coordinate when it comes down, they sell short. It's called selling short. So they make money when everybody else is losing money. We've seen it over and over again that the big industrial investors, the large investors on the individual level, and certainly the big banks, they have the ability to invest hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars at a time, to create what are called economic bubbles. We've seen one bubble after another since 2000 with the tech dot kind of bubble, and it burst. And these big banks were the ones that created that bubble. They were putting out IPOs on companies that had never earned a dollar, and as the stock went from $20 to $30 to $50 to $100, they were making money all the way up. And after a few years, some of those tech companies just weren't going to be successful. They pulled the wool out, they pulled the rug out of underneath them and collapsed the price on it. But they bet against it by selling them short. So they made money as these tech stocks, .coms lost money. They made money. They were the ones that set them up. They made money when it went down. Well, they've done it repeatedly since 2000. The same kind of huge investments in mortgage loan kinds of strategies, the derivatives, and that whole field was what was central in the 2007-2008 collapse. But they also created the economic bubbles in consumer credit and small business credit. And lately, since 2008, they've been creating a huge bubble in the student finance area as well as the car finance. I don't know if you're aware of this, but just a few companies have bought up almost all the big car finance companies, and that's why you see, 0% down and 0% interest. And, then there's some kicker like 6 months or 12 months later where you get hit with 14% interest. Those kind of strategies are out there, and some of my students have been caught with them. So, again, what we're seeing is these bubbles are being created, and they're making money as they go up and then as they come down. And we saw it in the commodity market. When corn was selling at $9 and beans were selling at $17, that wasn't because of supply and demand like the agricultural universities were telling us. It was because these large banks were putting hundreds of billions of dollars into the futures market and commodities. So they were able to raise the price time after time on beans and corns and you name it. to get that price to go up, and then about a year ago they let it come down. So right now you're lucky to get $3 and something for corn, and maybe $9 or $10 for your beans. So again, what I'm saying is there are things that can be done to prevent that kind of roller coaster, and I think we're going to have to do something like Iceland has done, where they've made it illegal to sell short. That makes sense to me. I would think any reasonable person would say that the stock market, and to a certain extent the bond market today, they're not really investing in assets, they're investing in blue sky. Take the stock market, which has been bouncing between 17 and 18,000. Many people believe that that's 3 times higher than the asset value of those stocks and the companies behind them, and that we could see a drop in those prices back down to the 6,000 level at any time. Maybe 6,000 is more of a reasonable level, and anything above 6,000 is a blue sky. If people investing in hope or investing in basically gambling kind of strategies to get the price to go up. And because the stock market here in the United States is made up of different kinds of investors, some of those have the ability to make it go up and some make it come down. I think we need to control that. I think the stock markets and the bond markets should be declared gambling, and you should have a license to, do those. I think a fairer way to have a stock market is to make these stocks tied to the asset value, fair market value of the company, fair market value of the stocks, so that when you're investing your $100 or $100,000, you're actually investing in the company. You're not investing in some psychological hope that it's going to go up, 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 which is really a very dangerous kind of cycle to get into. And it creates the ups and downs and the ups and downs. So as long as we allow that to happen, we're going to have economies go up and down. There really was no reason, in my opinion, and a lot of people, that we had the 2008 crash. What that was a false flag again by the financial institutions who wanted it to come down, who knew, they had planned it, they had it all scenarioized out. And if you don't believe that, just ask yourself, how is it possible that there were thousands of pages of financial legislation within 2 weeks after it happened? There's just no way that can happen unless somebody behind the scenes, behind the curtain, had already figured out that this was going to happen and had it prepared. When you look at it, the very same thing with 9/11. Within a very few weeks, there was all kinds of legislation passed on the emotion of the time that took away a lot of our civil liberties. The surveillance things and some of the practices of search and seizure and all of these things have come about because of a reaction to that event. And in my opinion, somebody planned it, somebody scenarioized it out, and a lot of people on the inside knew it was going to happen. You can fault me on it, but do some checking. There's a lot of information out there, and I don't think you have to be a dumb cow at all on these things. You can see that certain groups, certain special interests in the United States are controlling these kind of events, and they're doing it to make money. There's no doubt about it. But you can do things to prevent that. You could have stock markets that are based on real assets, and you could have, some of these called gambling and have them gambling. If somebody wants to invest $5,000 on a whim and a hope, I have no problem with that as long as they understand that it's not really a legitimate stock option or a stock kind of behavior. But there's other things that we could do to not have this kind of thing in our economy, not have this kind of thing in political, social kinds of realms. And you see it in the politics right now for the president. These people are battering each other on an emotional levels, which doesn't make any sense because it's not getting into any real issues. We're not getting any real solutions out of them. We're just getting, one's labeling another one something, and then another one wants to react to that, and the polls are going up and down as a result of that. if we really were talking about people that had good ideas, new ideas, I don't think we'd be, having to deal with this kind of presidential politics. So far, I haven't seen any of the candidates that had a lot to say that was new, or even had, some ideas that are going to change things. I think they're all taking money from these special interest groups, and they're in bed with them. I don't see how you can look at it any other way. So from the new independent party position, we're asking that things change. We're not asking for revolution or violence or anything like that. We're just asking that voters who have that opportunity this next election to make their statement and not vote for the Republican or Democrat, vote for somebody different, somebody who's not taking any money from these special interest groups. I hope you've picked that up, that the new independent party candidates do not take money from anybody. They voluntarily pledge not to raise money or spend money. All of the money comes from cooperative efforts on the state or national level. And we want to completely disconnect from that money, and that's the only way you're ever going to change things, is not be tied to their money. And once that happens, you could see that all kinds of things could come about. We could change how the stock market works. We could make it a much level kind of enterprise that maybe would guarantee everybody 6% return. That makes sense. We could pretty well stabilize the real estate economy so that everybody made 6%. So if you're starting to look at it, instead of riding the ups and downs and looking at it, how can we balance things out, then I think we're looking at some possible solutions. I would think that, just the other night they came to a new budget after a lot of controversy, and I'm willing to bet that there were secret kinds of amendments and riders put in there again so that certain people can get what they want out of the deal. And that's crazy. I think administratively on the House and Senate side, they could make rules where you had no riders or amendments to a bill that wasn't related to those. No more pork belly in any of these issues. We can have a government that works on a balanced budget. That seems only reasonable. Why can you allow the federal government to go on and on and on without a balanced budget? It doesn't make any sense. A couple other things that I think we could do to balance things and keep them balanced is that we could set some targets for what we would like the federal government to cost. Lately, in the last 5 or 6 years, sometimes it's been as high as 23% of the gross national product is going to the federal government. And that's crazy. It's absolutely crazy that if you go back 30, 40 years, we might have been only 7, 8, 9% of gross national product, and now we're at 23%. That's also happening in states. We've seen the very same thing here in Iowa. We've gone from 17,000 employees, state employees, to about 30,000 employees, and a budget that went from like $1.5 billion to $3.5 billion. We haven't increased that many people in Iowa. In fact, half of our counties are losing people. So how come we've had this surge in expense? It's the special interest groups. They want their dime or nickel, and they keep putting in elected officials who want to spend money. But every time you send $1 of tax money to Washington, D.C., you're basically taking $4 or $5 away from the local community. Every time you send $1 to Des Moines or a capital in a state, you're taking $4 or $5 again out of the local community. And then we wonder what's happening in our economy. How come it's stagnant? How come we can't see real growth? Well, that's the reason. You have close to 23% of the general GDP going to federal government, and in some cases here in Iowa, you have over 20% going into the state government cost. That's ridiculous. We have to be able to set targets, and I would say, for some reason, I like 15, I would say that we peg the federal government at 15% of GDP. If the gross national product is 17 trillion, then 15% of that is 2.5 trillion. That's a good place to start. Now, I know you can't get to it immediately, but right now I think the budget they're working with is 3.2 trillion. So we're almost $1 trillion above that target. And you can expect that they'll increase their expenditures, not decrease them. But I really think it's possible to bring that budget down to 15%. And I think one of the ways that we're going to have to do that is to reorganize government. What we're seeing is franchise departments that just want to spend more and more money, and a lot of it's going into private kinds of contracts that nobody can follow or keep track of. So there are administrative ways that if you're not being influenced by special interests who want that money, the bottom line is we have special interest groups who are farming the government. They're just taking everything they can make from government expenditures. So they give their money to the congressman, who then puts their stamp of approval on legislation that goes back to giving them more and more money, or more and more money in their marketplace. So there's ways that can be turned around, and I think having a new independent party who's not committed or tied to special interest groups is the first step. But then we have to develop some strategies. A balanced budget is one of the most reasonable ones I can think of. Second, reducing the cost of government is another very reasonable kind of thing, because every time you don't send the money to Washington, D.C., it's staying in the local community, and it is moving around 4 or 5 times. That's where economic growth comes. That's where new jobs come from. That's where new companies come from. It's no mystery. It's not a genie in a black bag here. It's pretty easy to understand that if all the money is going to Washington and they're spending it on special interest groups, that's not money that can be used in their local economy. So that would be another one. I would think also we have to come to some kind of reorganization of our government. We have just too many kind of departments going in different directions, and they all want more and more money each year. So a third thing I think we have to do is we have to go to zero-based budgeting. Every department, every activity has to start with zero and build it up, and they have to be able to justify those expenses. And one way to do that is to audit everything. There's a lot of departments that are never audited, and the Federal Reserve is never audited. A lot of big banks are never audited. We've provided them with a lot of subsidized money in the last 10 years, and they say that they're audited, but it's not really a deep audit. I think we would find with a deep audit that the 5 largest banks are all bankrupt, and the Federal Reserve is bankrupt. They have far more liabilities than they have assets, and they've been running on just the fact that they don't want anybody to know that. They're just running the way they've been in the past, and that has to come to an end. People say, well, they're too big to fail. I think if that's the situation, they need to fail. We need to divest some of those banks. Since 2008, the 5 largest banks have taken the money from the economic easing that was supposed to help out Americans. It never helped anybody on their mortgage. It never helped any of the small companies. Almost all of that money went to the big banks. The big banks took that money and bought the next 100 banks up. You can check me out on that, They took the government money and they bought up the next 100 banks. So now we have fewer and fewer banks. And some of these banks, control like 75% of all the consumer goods. They control 75% of all the international wires in the world. And, it's this kind of power that they're using to basically finance their own candidates in the Senate and the House. So that has to stop. We have to have people elected that represent the people, not these special interest groups, and that's very possible. As long as you have the right to vote, if you're a U.S. citizen and have that right to vote, you can change things. And it's as simple as that. If you just get off the duff and do some looking into these issues and make the decision to vote for somebody besides somebody who's taking money from everybody, It's not a complicated thing. It doesn't have to be a big turmoil. It doesn't have to be a big revolution. It's just something we need to do. And it's not going to be easy. You know, I've talked about my running for governor here a couple times as independent. You know, the newspapers won't even mention, that we're running. They won't mention any of the ideas we have. They won't print any of the news releases we have. So it's an uphill battle. And that's basically why I've turned to, putting these things on YouTube. If I don't text, tweet, or Twitter, I'm not that technical kind of person. But I can see that if I can't communicate with people this way on YouTube, that I don't have a chance of getting this information out. Even if we don't get elected to offices, I think the New People's Party, New Independent Party, has to bring forward some new ideas. And you can't complain and bitch about things if you're not willing to bring new ideas for it. And so what I'm doing is laying out the groundwork of some of the problems that are inherent in our system. It's a systemic kinds of issues. It's how we're structured. It's how we're working. And to change that is going to take a huge movement in a new direction. But I think we can balance things out. We don't have to go 18% Federal Reserve down to the 0%. We don't have to have banks offering 4% and then 0% on the savings. We can level it off. I would like to see banks being able to offer 4 to 6% on short to long-term interest. I would like to see the prime stay at 3%. I would like to see mortgages stay at 6-7%, and balance it out. Not for 5 years or 10 years, but for the next couple hundred years. Balance it out, and we can have an economy where everybody's employed and everybody's able to pay taxes. Right now, we have almost half of the people in the United States eligible to work not paying taxes. That's what I call not in balance. You can't operate a government with half of your people not paying taxes, and a lot of those companies that aren't paying taxes are very large companies. Top 100 companies are not paying any taxes. So again, we got to look at how we're financing our government. It's turned out that over the years that we have a certain percentage of gross national product going into the federal government, and it's been at about 18%. That's why I suggested 15. Let's bring it down. When we get up to 23%, that's too much. It's way too much. And it's hurting our economy. So let's go down to 18% on our way to 15% rather than on our way to 30%, which is where we're headed if we're not careful, particularly if we get into another large-scale war, regional war. If we're going to balance things, we have to have, some goals on the budget. We have to have some goals on revenue. And I would be in favor of a flat tax, 15% to everybody. Everybody benefits from the U.S. government, then I think everybody should pay. Nobody should not pay, and I think 15% of your income should go back to the federal government. If they're able to keep it down, their cost down to 15%, we should be able to pay 15% on our side. So that would mean no deductions, no exemptions. Everybody pays, whether you're a pastor or a senator. Everybody pays 15%. You can work that out. If the economy is where it's supposed to be, it should equal, enough revenue to take care of the government. And I would say that we should do that on the business side as well. We have one of the most complicated, unfair business tax systems in the world. It doesn't make any sense that we're having large companies moving to Ireland or moving to Switzerland just to avoid, our business tax system. We need to get control of that. And again, let's put it at 15%. And again, the only kind of deductions would be business deductions. And instead of it, coming out that they're paying 15% of gross profits, I think they should pay 15% of revenue. Catch it? Okay, that's a huge change, but it makes sense. If they're generating, $200 million in revenues, then they pay 15% of the revenues, whether it's profit or not. Okay, they just build it into their price. and I think we would have ample revenues into our government. So if we can do that on the federal level, I think we can do that on the state level. Here in Iowa, I think the total cost of government could be down in the range of 7, 8, 9% instead of 20-some%. I think they're going to have to find ways to reduce the cost, combine things, and that we have to do on the federal level. We have all these departments, and they're, alphabet kind of names to them. It doesn't make any sense. We should have a Department of Defense, a Department of Intelligence, a Department of Safety, a Department of Resources, a Department of Administration, a Department of State, Department of Commerce, and I can think of 9 of those areas. They'd be national defense, national intelligence, national security, and get rid of all these ABCs inside those so we only have one Department of Defense. We don't have an Army, Navy, Marine, and Air Force anymore. We have a Department of Defense. They all wear the same uniform, and they get along. We have one commander and one chain of command. We don't have an Air Force airplane, a Navy airplane, and an Army airplane. We have one plane. It makes some sense. See, and the reason we have these different planes, different ships, different units is because of special interests again, okay? I think we can operate with one national defense program. I think we can do that under the safety. We don't need the FBI and the DEA and the Marshal's Office and, half a dozen different agencies. We could get by with one, and I think it makes more sense. If you're talking about, interagency conflicts and not being able to communicate, we can resolve that. We have just one main agency involved with each of these departments. Intelligence is another one. Why we have NSA, CIA, and different groups out there. Many of them, like 100, have been added since 2008. And nobody has any idea what they're doing. In fact, in one case, it looks like they have 10,000 people reading magazines from all over the world. Well, that's a nice, cozy job, but it doesn't do any good. There's no appreciable intelligence that's come out of any of that. It's just spending because some retired general has got a friend in Congress who has put the money together in a budget, and it's there. That has to end. We have to be able to count for every dollar that goes into every budget, and the military has to be audited. It has to show that it's spending money wisely, okay? I am a very firm supporter of a national defense. We live in a crazy world, but I think they're spending money and wasting a lot of money. And I don't know how you can even look at it without coming to that same conclusion. They can be as accountable as anybody and how they spend money and how they ask for money, and I think we need to do that. But if you go down every one of the departments, I think we can do the very same thing by reorganizing, restructuring, and I'm not going to do it overnight. It might take 4 years, 8 years to accomplish it, but the end result should be a government of the people, for the people, and by the people. And not a government for the special interest groups and by the special interest group and of the special interest groups. Is that simple enough? Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.